So yeah. So the only thing I said so far for people watching on the YouTube is that our schedule's changing around a little bit. Doesn't really matter. But basically, there's now going to be an additional video, which is just talking about the nature of languages in general, specifically as a means of putting us in a position to talk about the language of thought hypothesis 2 weeks down the road. And also just so I had an opportunity to bring up some important terms that are going to come up throughout the latter halves of these Fodor articles, namely intentionality, representation, things like that. So short thing is you're going to have less work over the next couple weeks. And the video in which I discuss the language, a little bonus episode, I actually recorded it this morning, so it'll go up pretty quick, the same time that this one does. And it's only like 35 minutes long, so it's a quickie. And so that's that. The other important business thing. Next week is our 1 week in which Tuesday is a Monday and Monday is a Jewish holiday. So we don't have class next Tuesday. You will instead have your Monday classes in theory. I don't know if your professors are going to follow that. But all I know is we will not be meeting next week in person on Tuesday, but I still want to see your pretty faces. So we're going to meet on Thursday instead. I will send out a new Zoom link, but I will bombard you all with emails so you're all here. That's that. Background. We all good on the background stuff? Again, I will send out an email that says, like, basically what it means is if you read the whole Fodor article that I was assigning for today, you've done the reading for this class and next week's Thursday. So you don't have to think about that. You just have to come in and smile at me. All right. Any questions at this point? We all good? All right. So I'm going to erase this now. The basic background, I'm one of those people, I like to zoom out and remember where we came from, where we're going, etc. So we started off the semester by saying, what the hell is philosophy of psychology? Well, psychology is kind of understanding how human minds work, why humans do what they do. And then we said, well, if this is right, then are we going to have a science of this? And that's the idea of what psychology is. It's supposed to be a science, a bunch of rules and official principles and law-like rules for understanding why humans do what they do. And the obvious place to start with that is with our common sense ideas of what do you believe, what do you desire, how do they fit together. But then along came a bunch of people in the 50s and since who were like, well, that's not science. First we had the behaviorists like Skinner, who said that's not science because you can't measure beliefs, you can't measure desires. We need to do it all in terms of the environment and rats pressing little bars. Then we had a response to that in Chomsky who said, no, that's not right. We need to go back to the mind. We need to bring it back into the picture. Then we had a second strand of people who said, no, throw common sense psychology out. And these were the eliminative materialists like the Churchlands. And they say we should throw it all out because if we want this to be real science, at the end of the day, it's just going to be neuroscience. We don't need beliefs and desires, talk about brain states, talk about body movements, all that sort of stuff. And then in the class that you weren't here for, but I recorded the video, I talked about a response to that. And that response was, it's a very famous response that a lot of people have put forward, but the version I gave you was by Ned Block and Jerry Fodor, who we're also reading today and next class and the class after. He's a very important person in cognitive science, so we're going to read a lot of him. Plus, he just passed away a couple years ago, so I feel like, honor the dead. But anyway, so the idea is that if eliminative materialism is right and all human psychology is understood in terms of brain states, then you're not able to. So if you watch the video, this will be repeat. But if you didn't watch it, I just want to give you a little spiel. It's basically, if you want to explain behavior in terms of brains, then you're no longer able to say that there's something in common between animals and humans that have very different neurological systems. And you also can't say that there's anything in common between humans and any other possible things that have minds. So you'd have to say that whatever it is that explains human behavior and human psychology, it can't be explained, it can't apply to, say, any artificial intelligence we one day have, or any fictional robots that don't have meat in their heads. Because beliefs, desires, those things aren't scientific. They have to be thrown out, and we're talking in terms of brain states, but the only things that have brains like us are us. So therefore, you're no longer allowed to say things like, why did the dog, the human, and the robot look for a ball behind the couch? Intuitively, you'd want to say something like, well, they all believed the ball was behind the couch. But if you're a materialist or an eliminativist, you have to say, no, that's not the same thing. It's rather that the dog was in one brain state that had this effect, the human was in a different one, and the robot was in a third. And that just seems like you're losing a lot of explanation. So that's the general idea. So the back and forth thus far was like, let's put common sense on the table. Then we looked at one person who attacked it and a response to that. Another person who attacked it and a response to that. And now we're going to go with Fodor, who is now one of the major proponents of a common sense folk psychology based account of how the mind works. And he's one of the people and modern cognitive scientists in general. So if you hear someone talk about cognitive science, what they're talking about are people these days whose main aim is to show that if you accept that their beliefs, desires, etc., you can still come up with law-like regularities, and we can turn a science, anything that's as good as geology or as good as biology, about beliefs, desires, and how they make human beings do what they do. So that's what we're going to look at, is one of the motivations, and what, instead of saying this is what the people who argued against it said and respond to it, we're instead going to, over the next couple of weeks, look at, well, what happens if we take it seriously? And why should we think that actually common sense is more than just like common sense? It's actually the grounds of an actual theory that we can turn into a science. And once it's a science, we can start asking really interesting questions about things like how children learn, and things like why is it that all of us are able to speak languages, even those of us who, you know, were born without parents who talked directly to us, and things like this. So that's going to be the background. You can think of it as, up until this point, we've been looking at negative arguments against common sense and defending them. Now we're going to have like positive arguments for common sense. It's going to be Fodor arguing for why common sense is a good foundation for a theory of the mind and for understanding how human beings work. So hopefully that all made sense. That's just the big background picture. So I'm dividing up Fodor, as I said, into 3 classes. So this one is first going to be his positive arguments for thinking that common sense is a really good basis for science. Why it's not just the sort of bad ideas that people like the Churchlands or Skinner have, but is actually an actively great place to start. Then next class, we're going to look at his general framework in which he says, all right, if we accept that it's a good place to start, what does that look like in practice? What would it mean to take folk psychology seriously? What would it mean to say that our actual minds, scientifically speaking, it's true that beliefs are a thing? What does that entail? How does a mind have to be structured? How do we have to think about that for that to make sense? And then the class after that, we're going to look at his particular way of implementing that. He's going to say, if you agree that minds work in this way and beliefs and desires are real and they're this sort of thing, how can we think of a system? It's almost like, how would you have to program a mind, or what sort of computer system would it have to be running in order to do these things on the ground in practice? So that it's going to be 3 sections. This is just going to be, today's going to be the fun one, where it's almost the flip side of what we've been doing for the last 2 classes in person, where it's like, here are arguments against common sense. Here's Fodor coming out swinging, saying, no, here are arguments for common sense and why it's actually a really good way of deciding what people are doing, and why it's a lot better than people like the Churchlands give it credit for. So are we all on board? We're all good with the plan so far? That got a little rambly. I feel like these spiels are always a little rambly. Anyway, so I literally, if you actually look at the article, the parts that I'm going to be talking about today are just on the PDF. In terms of what's written on the pages, it's pages, well, the same as on the PDF. It's just going to be like 1 through page 1 through page 10-ish, I think. Yeah, we're not going to get past page 10. So if you didn't end up reading the whole article, you're good to go. It's just going to be his 3 main reasons for thinking that folk psychology is actually a great and powerful tool. And the way he comes out swinging by just saying, well, how does he start the article? What does he do? This is an excuse for me to get water, and my way to check that at least one person read it or can read now.
He takes an excerpt from a play as an example, and he uses that through the next couple pages as a defense and a positive reinforcement for common sense psych.
Yeah, he just comes out and he says, here's a play from Shakespeare. I mean, all of us have read Shakespeare, I'm sure, at some point in our lives. And also, it's unfortunate the way Shakespeare gets taught, because Shakespeare was like clearly, if we go back in time to what Shakespeare was actually like, he was basically the person who was writing like dirty comedies that people thought were hilarious, and now we think of it as all highbrow. But like the amount of sexual innuendo and like ridiculous shit in Shakespeare is amazing. And so these were plays which were originally designed, like the reason Shakespeare got so popular is people came to see his stuff, and not like the rich and powerful. People crowded in and they thought it was hilarious and loved it. And so in these plays, though, people were able to follow along with what was happening and understand, even when it got really, if you actually think about it, really quite complicated. So the passage Fodor uses at the start is one in which, in Midsummer Night's Dream, one character is in, so you've got this person and this person are in love. This guy, they love each other. This guy also loves her, and this one in the middle, these two promise each other they're going to meet in the woods one night. She gets there, he's not there, and she starts thinking through what could possibly have happened. And as Fodor lays out on that first page, it's a really complicated stream of thoughts. It's about this person. I don't know why she didn't have arms. Now she has arms. She was so busy worrying she lost her arms. She starts thinking about what this person would have thought and what this person would have thought about this person's thoughts, and how this person's thoughts might lead them to respond to this person in context of this one. And what you start to see, and you can sometimes actually like come across these things in your real life. You'll just think about you're telling a story. It's like, well, my cousin told my aunt that she thought that her mother was going to meet us at the mall on Saturday. And so when we're actually starting to think about it, it gets really, really complicated. And just think about how much planning goes into planning with some friends. Like you and your friends want to meet up on Saturday and you need to arrange a time to meet. So you actually, to even come up with that plan, have to think about your own thoughts, where the place is, what time it is. But you also have to know what's going on in your other friends' minds. Do they think that's a reasonable time? Do you know whether they have work? Do they think they're going to be able to go? It's really, really sophisticated and complicated. And so what Fodor starts off by doing is saying, not only is it sophisticated and complicated, it's really accurate. If I were to tell you, give me a second, I'll be right back. I'll be back in 2 minutes. I got to run to the bathroom. I'm currently far away from all of you. None of us are together. And yet all of you will know that you've got a few minutes about how long it takes a person to go to the bathroom to like do whatever, and then I'll be back. Or say you get a call from somebody who, you get a telemarketer call. You immediately know about what they're going to do. You've never met this person. They're probably not in the United States. And yet you know, based on what they're going to say, how to respond. And you're also going to be able to predict the sorts of things they're going to want to do to you, like sell you something you don't know, and know how to respond to get them to shut up and shut off the phone. So this is incredibly complicated stuff. And so Fodor begins by saying, when people like the Churchlands are saying this is like alchemy, he's like, no, it's not. This is so much more predictably accurate. Alchemy was just things like, is it shiny? Is it not? This is, I can predict on the basis, like if I know you want to have children, then I can make predictions about what your life's going to be like 30 years from now. And maybe it's not going to be true. Maybe something will come up. But if I know you're very dedicated to having children, I can make predictions about years down the line. If I know that your mother's cousin's sister's brother has a dog, I can know that your mother's cousin's sister's brother's buying dog food on the regular. Like, these are predictions I can make. I can know that next week they're probably also going to have to buy or make sure they have dog food. I can predict, if I know you like something and I know somebody else likes something, I know that if I put you two together in a room, you might get along. Like, think about how complicated it is just to know which of your friends are going to get along with other people. You have to know what your friends are like, what sorts of things they like, what their experiences were like in the past. And yet we effortlessly think about like how much thought and complicated stuff goes into, like, you set two people up. If you set them up well, like, you have thought 7 steps down the line in a way that like is really sophisticated and complicated. And so that's really all that Fodor's trying to say at the start, is not only that, you can pretty accurately predict. If you know your one friend is a Yankees fan and your other friend is a diehard Red Sox fan, they've never met each other, can predict with pretty good accuracy they aren't going to get along. Like if all they each talk about is their favorite baseball teams, they're not going to get along with each other. You've never have to seen them. You never have had to be in a room with them. You just know off the bat they're not going to get along. So this is what he's talking about how accurate it is. You can predict what people are going to do. Like, you know, I can predict what you're all going to do at 10:45 on Tuesdays for the next couple months. Like, that's pretty incredible. I don't know where any of you are. I don't know who is around. I don't know why you're there. I don't know, like, whether you have pets. And yet I know where you're going to be at a certain time. And how do I know? Straight up belief, desire, psychology. I know that you have a desire to pass this class. I know that you have a belief that this is when this class meets. And therefore, I can predict there's going to be almost 40 people here in front of me on this screen, some of them with their cameras on, some with their cameras off. All of that simply by belief, desire, psychology. And that is incredible power. Like, think about how many variables. It's like building a bridge. Like, think about, you got to take into account how big the bridge is and everything. And yet we're doing this all the time, constantly. And so Fodor's idea is, if it's this powerful and this accurate and this right so much of the time, isn't it kind of a non-starter to say that it's not true? Like, isn't it, once you realize how powerful it is, the idea that belief, desire, psychology can't be right because it's so fundamentally flawed kind of falls away. And you start to think like, no, folk psychology is pretty spectacular at what it does. And this suggests to him that, well, in that case, it's probably close to the truth. Like, you know, there's probably some things that need to be fixed and added to, but if it's this close to being right, it's probably pretty damn close to being, or if it gets things right and allows you to predict this often, there's probably something like belief, desire, common sense psychology that's correct. So is everyone on board thus far? Are we all doing okay? Any questions at this point while I drink more water? And really, here's the, like, people love movies about mind reading, and people love thinking about mind reading and like, oh, I can like control things with my brain. But literally, that's what everyday human psychology is. When I speak, I am literally putting things into your head. If I say elephant, what are you all now thinking of?
Elephants.
Yeah, you're thinking of elephants. That's pretty incredible. I am miles away from you all, and yet I can do that. And Fodor's saying the very fact that I'm able to predict when I say elephant, you're going to all think of elephants. And if I were to say draw an elephant, all of you would try your best to draw a thing with a big trunk and yada yada. That is powerful stuff. Now, so that's the first part of this article in which he's saying like, look, it's so powerful. Anyone who wants to throw it out is just like, you know, you're throwing out the baby in the bathwater. However, there are these things, and this is what my big long email, hopefully at least some of you read it. What was the first of the big long emails about? The big fancy stupid Latin word?
Cerebris paramus.
Yeah. Just for the way no one knows how people actually said Latin, but now everyone says ceteris paribus, but probably just because it's easy to say. And so what Fodor says at this point is that, all right, a lot of people come along and say, you are greatly over, someone like the Churchlands comes back and says, all right, Fodor, you've tried to convince me that common sense psychology is incredibly powerful and so good at predicting. But you're forgetting certain sorts of things. You're forgetting the fact that whenever you actually look at belief, desire, psychology, it's not as accurate as you're saying it is, because very often it seems to have these ceteris paribus clauses built in, or this idea is that things in psychology only happen ceteris paribus. So what does he mean by this? And what do these arguments look like? Well, someone will come along and say something like, you, Fodor, are also, if you hear a lawnmower, it's because there's a lawnmower going. So I apologize if there's a loud noise in the background. People come along and say, well, Fodor, your psychology, we can't come up with these psychological laws because if you actually look at it, what ends up happening is they only look good because they have these built-in all else equal clauses. And so basically what you end up saying, Mr. Fodor is, or Dr. Fodor or Jerry Fodor, what you end up doing is building in that all you end up saying is something like, my theory works except when it doesn't work, or this is going to happen except when it doesn't happen. And so this is the response that people have to Fodor. So for instance, you say something along the lines of, my two friends are going to get along great. They both love these things, and then they don't get along great. So you predicted, and then they get together and they don't get along. And you're like, why didn't that work? Well, it actually turned out that one of them was had a really bad stomach ache the whole time and just couldn't get along with anyone because they were in incredible pain. So someone's going to come along, someone like the Churchlands comes along and says, look, Fodor, your folk psychology isn't that good. Your folk psychology can't explain this fact. You make a prediction and it got the prediction wrong. And then Fodor comes along and says, look, it's right ceteris paribus, provided that nobody has a random stomach ache, provided that things stay as we expect them to be, then it's going to hold. It is a general law that holds, provided all else is equal. And that's all ceteris paribus means, is all else being equal. To this, the Churchlands and someone like that responds and says, that's cheating. You can't just build in a ceteris paribus clause. You can't just say all else being equal, this will hold. Because all else being equal, this will hold is just a way of saying, like, it's a get out of jail free card. It's like going into Vegas and saying, I'm going to bet on the Giants to win the Super Bowl. And then if they don't win the Super Bowl, you go in and say, actually, my bet was that the Giants would win the Super Bowl unless they didn't win the Super Bowl. And they didn't win the Super Bowl. So the second part kicked in and you still owe me money. Like, everyone understands that's bad reasoning. So the people like the Churchlands are trying to say, Fodor's claims about these things hold ceteris paribus. Fodor's cheating. These laws aren't that good, and the power we just described 5 minutes ago is not nearly as good as it is. Because, for instance, the fact that I knew you were all going to be here at 10:45, it doesn't predict certain things. So, for instance, my prediction that you'll be here next week at 10:45, is that an accurate prediction? Next week, Tuesday at 10:45, is that an accurate prediction? No. Why not? Because of this. We don't have class next week. So the Churchlands are saying things like, well, look, your predictions can't be perfect because I know your desires and your beliefs, etc. And now you're saying, well, all else being equal, like assuming CUNY doesn't do something weird with the schedule. So look, Fodor, you don't have science here. To which Fodor comes back and gives a response in favor of ceteris paribus clauses. So is everyone on board with kind of how this is going so far? Just to review, because we just got a little in the weeds. It's basically, Fodor first says, look at all the power of science. And then he reintroduces us to people like the Churchlands who deny the power. And he says, now some people come along and say, what I just described, this incredible power is illusion. Because in truth, all of these predictions have ceteris paribus clauses. It's only these two people will get along together ceteris paribus. Or you will, if you believe that the Yankees are going to win the World Series and you like betting, you will bet on the Yankees ceteris paribus. And the Churchlands say the very fact that you have to include a ceteris paribus clause in your scientific laws shows, or your scientific predictions shows that it's not good science. To which Fodor responds and says, the fact that I include ceteris paribus clauses is not a sign that I'm doing bad science. All it shows is that I'm not doing basic physics. And his point is that if you actually look at all science, everything outside of pure particle physics of the sort of like atoms and electrons and everything like that, every scientific law you come across has a ceteris paribus clause in it. So the fact that psychology doesn't say psychology is bad. All it says is that psychology is not physics. So for instance, here's something that you learn in biology. How do you define that two things are members of the same species in biology? Two mammals are members of the same species. Anyone know what the criteria is?
If they can have children.
Yeah, they can reproduce together. So you say this cat who's a female and this cat who's a male are members of the same species because they can have kittens together. But note that this is a ceteris paribus clause. Why is this a ceteris paribus clause? Because well, Why is it a ceteris paribus clause? What's something which, even if two cats are both, like they're not robots from Mars that are dressed up to look like cats, they're actual cats, what could prevent them? What could kick in the ceteris paribus clause?
If one is spayed or neutered.
Yeah, if one of them's neutered, then they're members of the same species, they're members of the same species, they can reproduce together, ceteris paribus. If one of them gets his balls cut off, it's not having any babies, no matter what you're having it with. So this is how it kicks in something like biology. His example is in geology. Here's a geological law. All else being equal, ceteris paribus, a river will erode its banks and change its course over time. So if you put, like, if things go as planned, ceteris paribus, rivers change their course. And if you actually know anything about rivers and maps, if you look at old maps, like very old maps, we're talking hundreds of years old, rivers are actually in different spots than they are today, which has led to all these things where, like, if you read up in side note, I find archaeology super interesting, and there's all these really famous cities. So like, no one knows where certain cities from the ancient world are because they know they were at the mouth of a river, only the river has moved, and so no one knows where to look anymore. And so he's saying this is a law of geology that allows, and geology is study of rocks and land formations and that stuff. And he says this is a general rule, but it holds ceteris paribus, because if all of a sudden we have an ice age, the river freezes and it doesn't flow anymore, then of course this law isn't going to hold. Or if all of a sudden some human comes along and builds a dam, the river's not going to erode and change its banks because the river's not going to flow in the same way. So he's saying if you look at any science outside of pure particle physics, in which you're talking about atoms existing in a spaceless void where all we are is empty space with little neurons and, no, not neurons, neutrons and electrons that are made out of quarks that float around, and then, you know, it's, I don't even know what to do with string theory, but yeah, so unless you're talking about that stuff, it's always going to have ceteris paribus clauses. And he says, if it's always got ceteris paribus clauses, then who cares that psychology does? All that shows us is psychology is not pure physical science. So that's how he responds to these ceteris paribus clause worries of people like the Churchlands. He's saying ceteris paribus clause is much more than just it holds unless it doesn't. It's rather something along the lines of it holds so long as no factors that are explained by something other than our science come along. So when we're coming up with laws of biology, we're not taking into account like veterinarians with scissors. When we're thinking about the movements of rivers, we're not taking into account human behaviors and dam building. So his first argument is just, it's super powerful, and anyone who says it isn't, because it sometimes predicts things wrong, is asking way too much. They're ignoring the fact that ceteris paribus laws are everywhere. Every part of every science outside of particle physics has it. So therefore, we should take the power of belief, desire, psychology in our everyday sense super seriously. We should conclude that it's correct by and large, and maybe we'll have to tweak it and change some things, but it's a good starting point. And we have to take it as a good starting point because we assume it's true and we do incredibly powerful things. So is everyone, any questions at this point? This is getting a little more lecture-y than I wanted, but you know, it's hard to talk, like to get people to jump in when we're on these Zoom calls. All right, let me pull up my notes, see if I can find something that's a bit more back and forthy. All right. So he then has two other main arguments for why folk psychology is really not just crap, it's actually a good start to our science. And so his next 2 points that he has, I'm just going to write these up, are 1, it's depth, and 2, it's indispensable. So remember last week I was talking about how the Fodors make the Churchlands, people like the Churchlands make these arguments that folk psychology looks a lot like alchemy. It makes some functional predictions in the same way that, like, if a person has a belief, they will do this. Or if a person desires a sandwich, they will go and get it. That looks like a pretty straightforward, very surface level explanation along the lines of, if a metal is imbued with the spirit of mercury, it will shine, or something like that. And so the Churchlands say, folk psychology is no better than this crap science like alchemy. Churchland and that group then is committed to it being a very shallow, basic level explanation along the lines of, astrology is another one of these, where like, if the sun is in this particular position, then you will be, or if you are born with Mars in or Mercury in retrograde, then you will be full of passion when you get over it. It's a very straightforward social, like shallow sort of explanation. Fodor wants to say that anyone who claims that folk psychology and our ordinary belief desire psychology is like that is ignoring the level of depth and complexity you're positing as going on below the surface. When you say someone has a desire for a sandwich, you're not saying that this underlying desire will cause them to get a sandwich straightforward. It's a very sophisticated sort of thing. And this is what we were talking about at the first class. So if you have a desire for a sandwich, what else has to be going on for you to actually go and get a sandwich? Like, the desire for a sandwich is not by itself enough to go and get a sandwich. So in something like alchemy, it's very dumb. And the way the alchemists would talk is they would say things like, if it's got mercury in it, then it shines. Straightforward explanation. And so the Churchlands say, and folk psychology is just like that. It's just as simple, just as dumb. And then the Fodor comes back and says, no, it's not. It's got a lot of sophistication under the surface. So one thing you need to go get a sandwich is desire. Second one, though, is what Kaywin said. You need money, or at least you need the belief that you have money in your pocket. What else needs to go into this? You need to make sure, you don't have diet restrictions that are causing you to go and get this. Or like, if your desire for a sandwich is such that you want that sandwich, you also need to make sure there's not a competing desire to like follow a diet or something like that. What else has to go in? If you've got the desire for a sandwich, you've got the money, you don't have other desires like diet restrictions. What else do you need to do? Yeah, you need to know where, so you need to find a store, right? Thank you. And also, Cynthia, you have to go and get it. Matthew, you need to know like, seriously, something like the weather is going to play a role, because if you find a store, you need to find out how to get to that store. And so that's a complicated process. So going into this walking and going and get a sandwich is so much mental sophistication. And so what Fodor's point is, it's not like something along the lines of like, if you see a cloud in the sky, it's gonna rain, which, is pretty accurate, but wrong all the time, because they can't even, they can't ever get the weather right, because predicting the weather seems to be actually impossible. Cynthia has another one of, how far are you away from this place with a sandwich? Knowing that you have a desire for a sandwich, if you're on the top of a mountain in the middle of nowhere, your desire to get a sandwich is not enough to predict your behavior. It's not like something simple like, it's full of mercury, therefore it's gonna shine, or I'm full of like other really bad scientific explanations. Why does this fall? Because it's full of the fallingness essence or something like that. So those are all bad science. And Fodor says, if you actually look at folk psychology or ordinary belief desire psychology, it's not in any way simple like that. It's really complicated. Anyone, even when you're predicting what a friend's gonna do, you're predicting what they want, what they desire. You know something about their personality. If you want to know, are they gonna ask the person, you see them, somebody gets an undercooked steak. You need to know about, and you want to know, what are they going to do next? This person ordered they ordered a well-done steak and they got a very underdone steak. Think about the number of things you need to know to predict what this person's going to do next. If you want to know whether they're going to put back the steak, what do you need to know about them? Well, you need to know, did they say well? Because how strongly did they want that well-done steak? That's one thing. Another is, are they a shy person? Are they somebody who's just too shy to send it back? Are they somebody who just always is grumpy? Yeah, racist personality. Yeah, you need to know their personality. You also need to know, like, are they in a hurry? if they believe that they have somewhere to be afterwards, they're never going to want to send that steak back. Another one, Kendra, correct. How long have they been waiting? If you've been waiting 3 hours for a steak, you're less likely to send it back because you don't want to wait another 3 hours. All of this stuff goes in. This is not a simple explanation. And you can think about it all in terms of beliefs and desires. They have a desire for a new steak, but they also have a personality of like shyness or a desire not to talk to people. And they have a belief that it's going to take fucking forever to get their new steak. And they have a belief that they have somewhere they have to be. And they have a desire not to be embarrassing. Or they're somebody who just loves sending food back. They just love being confrontational. All this stuff goes into the explanation. I mean, and we all know that person. Like, I feel like it's always an older person who just, you guarantee no matter what the food they get at a restaurant is, they're sending, something's going to be wrong with it. The bread's a little too soggy. It's not cut right down the middle. There's always somebody, you know. I'm the opposite. I'm the person who, like, if I order a steak and you bring me, like, you know, a pile of peas, I'm not going to send it back because I just hate doing that. That's a personality thing. Now you know something about me that you can predict my behavior for the future. I'm not sure when we're going to be ordering steak together, but if we were and COVID weren't happening, now you know that. So that's Fodor's second point. He says, not only is it incredibly powerful, it's very sophisticated. This is not some dumb basic level theory like astrology where like your horoscope says you're born on this day, therefore you're going to get wealthy. Like that's like a basic sort of thing. This is lots going on under the surface, which explains other things going on under the surface, which together in a complex way combine for your behavior. So that's the second thing he says. So he says it's really successful. It's really complicated. These are good signs that we're onto something useful. These are good signs that something good's going on here. And then his final point is that you can't get rid of, if you want to explain what's going on in psychology, you can't get rid of beliefs and desires and talk like that unless you were, or you can't get rid of it and still explain the very thing you want to explain. Because very often, to even describe the behaviors or the actions that you want to explain in psychology, you have to bring into account psychological notions from common sense. So this is actually, I don't know how many of you remember this, but this was very similar to Eddie's back right in time. This was very similar to Eddie's point last class, in which he said, how does a eliminative materialist explain going to the fridge to get something to eat when you're hungry? And I tried to give this explanation of what what an eliminative materialist would say is, well, first there's a brain state that just moves your arms in this way, and then you go up and what happens next is you reach into the fridge, and that was a brain state, and yada yada. And it seems like, which I think was what Eddie was going for, is that's not really explaining what we wanted to. We wanted to understand what made this person get a sandwich that they wanted to eat, not like give me an explanation of how all their arms moved. So the idea is that Fodor's trying to say here is that to even explain the thing we want to explain, you need to describe it in mental terms, or else there's nothing you want to explain. So here's another one. A behaviorist is going to come along and try to explain the fact that has anyone here been bitten by a dog ever? Anyone gotten bit in like a bad bite, like the sort that now you avoid dogs? Religious. So Nadia's kind of shaking. Nadia.
So actually it was during the pandemic. I was actually drinking, and my friend's dog doesn't like people kissing him, so he bit. I have a huge scar on my face now. He just bit my face after I kissed him, but that doesn't affect my love for dogs. I have a dog and I still love dogs. So yeah.
So I think this is a really good case of like, what would a behaviorist say in this? Well, they have to say like, it would be tough for behaviorists to explain why you don't avoid dogs despite this. But very often, like if a little child the best way to determine whether someone's going to avoid something in the future is whether they had bad experiences with it as a kid. Like if your first experience ever were to be bit by a dog and end up with a big scar, odds are you're never going to go near dogs again. But if you've got a lot of background and like you've got a dog and you love dogs, it's not going to offset that. But so let's imagine we've got a case in which a little dog or a little kid gets bit by a dog, and they're now terrified of dogs. What are they probably going to do for the rest of their lives?
Avoid them.
Yeah, they're going to avoid dogs. So it seems like this is the behavior we want to explain psychologically. What are they going to do for the rest of their life? Well, they're going to avoid dogs. But Fodor's point is that this right here, this statement, avoid dogs, is itself a fundamentally psychological notion. It is not physical. It is not behavioral in terms of body movements. And the reason why is, describe what avoiding a dog looks like to me. What does it look like to avoid a dog?
Running, changing the path you're walking on to avoid someone coming.
Yeah, so you're changing the path. But if you're someone like a eliminative materialist, you're going to have to say, well, you explain avoiding dogs in terms of brain states. To which you respond, all right, but avoiding dogs, walking away from them, keeping their distance looks different on different occasions. Sometimes if you're walking down the middle of the sidewalk and a dog is coming straight for you, or say you're walking down like let's just draw it up here. Here's a road. You're walking on the right side. We're looking from above. You're going this direction. And the dog is right here, coming this direction. In this case, avoiding the dog looks like this. It involves going to the left. That's what avoiding a dog looks like. It involves brain waves firing, or brain parts firing electrical currents that cause you to walk to the left. However, what would have happened if instead you were walking over here? You're walking over here in this direction, and the dog's coming from this direction. What does avoiding the dog look like in this case?
You go the opposite direction.
Yeah, you're going to the right. Now, this might not seem like a really fundamental point. Like, yeah, you're avoiding the dog, you're going left or right. But think about how hard it would be to give a characterization of these differences in terms of brain states. Because in brain states, different parts of your brain are going to be firing depending on whether you're going right or going left. Like if you stimulate one part of the motor cortex, your right arm moves. If you stimulate a different part, your left arm moves. They're different parts of the brain. It's in different states. And yet whether I raise my right arm or my left arm isn't going to change something like whether I'm raising my hand. So it seems like the level at which we want to explain human psychological behavior is at levels of like avoid dogs. Other times sometimes avoiding a dog means going into the house because the dog's outside. Other times it involves going out of the house because the dog's inside the house. Sometimes avoiding the dog means going upstairs. Sometimes it means going downstairs. Sometimes it means swimming. Whatever you say, swimming and walking are fundamentally different activities that if we were to look at the brain of someone swimming and the brain of someone walking, they would look completely different, totally different areas of the motor cortex, very different systems. So from the point of view of someone like the Churchlands, who's saying that every behavior is to be explained in terms of the brain, you're going to have to say that avoiding a dog by swimming away from it and avoiding a dog by running away from it, those are totally different behaviors, totally different brain states. They can't be characterized. So what you start to see is, what Fodor's point is in the end, you can't even describe what it is you're trying to explain in psychology in terms other than psychological terms. Avoid dogs is a fundamentally mentalistic approach. You can't say avoid dogs is to move your arm in a certain way, because sometimes avoiding dogs is moving your arm in a way. Sometimes it's running away. Sometimes it's like getting a big stick and poking a dog. Like what you define the behavior of avoid dogs as is so different on so many different occasions that you're never going to be able to give a purely physical account of a behavior like avoiding dogs. And Fodor's point is when we look at psychology, what we're trying to actually explain, the things you want to give an account of are things like avoiding dogs, things like seeking a reward. And I think Ray brought up this point back when we were talking about behaviorism a few weeks ago of how do you it seems like the very idea of you give the rat a reward seems to assume something about what reward means and that the rat isn't somehow thinking in terms of niceness and badness. And it seems very hard, and Fodor's point is you can't even describe the thing you want to describe in psychology unless you take for granted certain core ideas about the human mind, namely that there are things, beliefs, and desires. You could explain this very straightforwardly as why did the person avoid the dog? Well, they believed there was a dog there, and they believed going that direction would avoid the dog, or they believed they could keep space between them by going that direction. If you don't bring in beliefs and desires, it gets really, really hard in a simple way to even explain what they were doing. You say it would have to be something like, why did they walk in that direction? Well, more accurately, why did their brain fire in this particular way at that particular time? Well, that brain fired in this way because there was light hitting the retina, which caused this, which caused that, which caused this, which caused that. But that's not the sort of thing. We want to know what every act of avoiding dogs has in common. We want to know what walking to the right side of the street has in common with walking to the left side of the street. We don't want to know what particular brain state set off a particular act of walking across the street when there happened to be a dog. So does everyone understand like this general point? It's kind of this is our first real philosophy-y oomph, I think, of like arguing. And I think it's a really clever, brilliant argument. The idea is, if you look at the behaviorists and you look at the churchlings, it's not just that they can't give us a good answer to the question. It's rather they can't even ask the question, what is it to avoid dogs, behaviorally speaking? Because they can't even give a definition of what it is to avoid, because to avoid is by its very nature a psychological idea. So this is where he's saying it's indispensable. You cannot do anything that we'd want to do in psychology unless you accept certain basic ideas like beliefs and desires and certain contents and things like that. So like to take another example, even something as simple as me speaking, you can't understand like why did you get up? Well, or why did you say that thing? Well, you can't even understand the thing you said unless you explain it in terms of like the mental process which caused you to move your mouth in a certain way, knowing it was going to like, I can't describe what I'm doing now without bringing into account what I'm intending to get you to think at that time in this way. So the idea is that even if you wanted to get rid of folk psychology, even if we had reason to, it's really unclear how we could and still keep in place the thing we want to explain. I got a little excited there. I think this argument's brilliant, so I just got a little like jumpy. Are people on board with the general idea though? Of just like what the argument is. So the idea is it's not just an incredibly powerful system. It's not just that it has an incredible explanatory depth. It's rather that when you're giving a psychological explanation for things, you're looking to describe things at levels of generalization that another theory couldn't explain. So like another way of putting this is, so Ray, so I'm gonna read Ray's question out loud because it's really, really good, and then respond to it as I think Fodor would respond. So the question is, or he points out, he thinks that materialists could probably give an account for avoiding dogs. It's probably the fact that we were bitten by a dog that builds a neural connection between seeing a dog and then some sort of action. So what Fodor's going to say is, it's certainly going to be the case that the act of biting a dog caused there to be a certain sort of brain, it's going to impact your brain. It's going to cause there to be a neural connection between different areas of the brain. But what Fodor's going to say is, define this action though, of what is this action that you're performing when you're avoiding a dog? What is it when you see a dog and then you perform an action? And his point is, the very idea of action is itself going to have to be defined in mentalist ways, because you can't define action you perform to avoid dogs in a purely physical way. Rather, you have to like if you could describe it purely physically, like if you look at a pulley system, like I'm not sure how many of you had to like design a pulley system. Every pulley system, you can give a mathematical equation of what pulling upwards looks like, what pulling downwards looks like, how much force gets applied here affects that. It's all straightforwardly mathematical. Fodor's point is, if you're trying to give that sort of mathematical, mechanical explanation of what the action of avoiding dogs looks like, you're going to have to actually give infinitely many different answers of what that brain state looks like, because it's going to be a different brain state in different situations. So while you might say that there's now a connection between the activity of seeing, also another issue is, what does seeing a dog look like? Like in a purely mechanical brain sense, it's going to be slightly different every single time, because it'll always involve the occipital lobe at the back. But seeing different shaped dogs in different degrees of lighting will have very different impacts on the brain itself. And because of this, even the act of something as simple as seeing a dog is difficult to define in purely mechanical terms. It seems like to define what it is to see a dog is to define something in terms of like what you, a person, are doing and what awareness you have of the situation, or what you could say that there was light that hit this retina that caused the retina to do this, that caused this to this to this. But it seems like that alone doesn't explain what it is to see a dog. There's something about like, to see a dog is to have light hit the retina and then eventually form belief, oh shit, there's a dog. It seems like to even describe what it is to see in a sense that explains your behavior, you need to bring in these mental terms. And that's what Fodor's going to try to push. Now, I agree. I think Ray's right that the Fodor hasn't had the last word. I think that a good materialist would be able to push back and fight on this stuff. And I mean, they do. But the idea that the line Fodor tries to push is that that's never going to work. In the same way that, like, I want you, how many sports fans do we have of any particular sport at whatsoever? All right. So describe to me what winning. So let's go with let's go with soccer, since that's more universal. And to put my cards on the table, I like it better. Soccer. Describe to me what winning a soccer game looks like step by step.
You score more goals than your opponent.
Okay, score more goals. Now describe to me what scoring a goal looks like.
You need to get the ball past the goal line of the opposing team's goal.
Okay, opposing team's goal. So what does getting the ball past the goal line look like?
The entire ball needs to be past the entire line.
So we've got physical terms of entire ball past entire line. Now describe to me what I need to do with my body precisely in order to make sure it gets across the line.
You can use your feet, knees, head, or chest to push the ball, I guess, across the goal line.
Yeah, and you just, Kabir, you did a great job illustrating exactly what the issue is, which is that there's no one way to score a goal in soccer. You can do it with your head, or your chest, or your knees, or your left foot, or your right foot, or if the ref's not looking, you can even punch it in as long as no one sees.
Yep.
These are all different. So there is no one answer of what bodily motion it is to score a goal in soccer. It seems like to describe what scoring a goal in soccer is, you have to talk in soccer terms. You need to talk in terms of the rules of the game, and you have to talk in terms of body parts, and you have to talk in terms of teams and goals and balls. You don't just say to score a goal in soccer is to move your body in this particular way. It's like, no, that's one way you can score a goal in one particular way. And so Fodor's saying this applies to just in the same way that the only way to describe winning a soccer game is to describe it in terms of soccer. The only way to describe avoiding dogs, or going and getting a sandwich, or giving a friend a hug, or being happy is in terms of things that are by their very nature psychological. And yes, we could give a purely physical account of every single different beat. Like if we took a time machine and we had a perfect look inside every brain of every person who has ever scored a goal in soccer, we could give a perfect neural account of every single way someone has ever, like what's been going on in the brain every time a goal is scored. And so we could say something like, to score a goal in soccer, the action of scoring a goal in soccer is to be in this brain state, or this brain state, or this brain state. And you'd have a really long list, because soccer's been played since the late 1800s. And if we had every goal ever, and everyone would be slightly different. And Fodor's point is, when you're doing that, you've lost sight of the goal. The goal is to explain what it is to score a goal in soccer, not what the brain is doing. Who cares about that? If we're going to give an explanation of what it is to score a goal in soccer, we need to explain it in terms of soccer terms. in the same way, if we want to give an account of what it is to avoid dogs, it's not enough to know every way anyone has ever avoided a dog and give a perfect neurological account of what they're doing. That's not useful to us. If we want to be able to predict people's behavior and understand and actually come up with a science, we need to keep our terms around so that we're actually describing the things we care about. We need to we can say, why'd they avoid the dog? Well, they believed it was going to bite them and they didn't want it to. Boom. That's it. Simple explanation. We don't have to define what their brain state was doing. We don't have to worry about what their history was. We don't have to do any of that stuff. 2 sentences explain why this person avoided a dog, as long as we're allowed to talk in terms of beliefs and desires. And he says, not only that, you describe the very activity that you're trying to explain. You need to use avoid is a behavioral term.
Well,
So
why
does
do
everyone- say that again?
why
Yeah.
did the definition need to be more basic instead of being more complicated?
So here's generally, that's a really good question. So this is a question that gets to the very root of science. And here's just a general, and it's something which this is a really like high level question of just very generally, scientists generally have a practice of the simpler explanation is the better one. Now, this is a really good thing to bring up of why do they believe that? And part of it is a practical reason of just, if you can get away with it, bless you, if you can get away with a simpler answer and it does just as much as the more complex one, go with the simpler one, because then your calculations will be easier. But this does raise a very big question of, well, is that a good enough reason to believe that it's true? And if you actually take a class in the philosophy of science, a lot of it is asking, why am I taking the simpler explanation? Yes, this is called Occam's razor. Occam's razor's idea is do not posit excess things if it can be explained more simply. And there is a really big question here. Why is Occam's razor a good way of going? And generally, like the gut feeling people generally have is because most of the things in the world we see can be explained mathematically in rather not really simple terms, but you can give mathematical explanations for things that don't involve a lot of moving parts. And very often you don't want things that are like or statements. So if you're going to give an explanation of avoid dogs in purely behaviorist terms, you're going to have to get rid of the word avoid dogs and instead say something like you move right, or you move left, or you move up, or you move down. And generally the goal, I'm not quite sure what the full reasoning behind it is in terms of like why you would justify it, but in terms of practicality, there's just a general principle in science, and it seems to hold, because if you can give a single statement without any, it is in this way or this way or this way, then it's law-like. And the more law-like it is, the more tendency it is to be accurate in future occasions. So that's another issue with this, is if you were going to give these or statements, you're always going to have to be adding on more ors. While if you can give a single simple statement, it's far more likely to apply both now and to all future cases. But that is a super complicated question where if you ever take a philosophy of science class, most philosophy of science is basically, all right, the scientists say this is true, but what does that even mean? And why should I think it's that way? Like if you're told that most of the world is atoms in the void, but constantly people are redefining atoms. So why should I believe this sort of thing? So it's like it's a way of engaging, instead of being like, it's just a theory, therefore it could be wrong. It's much more of a, what does it even mean to be true in a science? So that's, if you don't take that class, that's fine. But that's kind of what's in the background here. And it's generally just a matter of fact assumed that simpler things are better. And very often, the simpler things are more likely to continue being true in the future. Also, yeah, Ray just raised a really good one. This is something I thank you for bringing this up, Ray, because this is another really good point. Another one is more complex theories generally make more assumptions about the way the world is. And the more assumptions you make, the more assumptions you have that could be wrong. So if all I need to do to explain a certain behavior is assume that if part of the reason that people liked the theory of gravity from Newton so much is he only had to say there's one thing that explains everything: gravity. Gravity explains why why little things fall into big things. It explains why things are in an elliptical orbit. So the sun doesn't go, or the earth doesn't just go in a circle around the sun. It kind of loops in this way. Gravity explains that. And so you only have to assume the existence of one thing, gravity. If you have to say, and part of the reason that people started moving towards a gravitational theory because the old-fashioned way of understanding how the planets moved was there were like 8 different spheres. One of them was filled by the angels, and the angels moved in one way, and this one had planets in it. And so this old-fashioned theory of how the universe moved, then Newton comes along and says, there's just one thing. And because there's just one thing, you don't have to make assumptions about what angels are like, which could prove to be wrong, namely like whether they exist or not. You don't have to make assumptions about what the differences are between planets and moons. If you just say gravity, there's less places to make assumption errors. So that's a really long-winded way of attempting to answer what is ultimately an excellent question of, yeah, but why should we care if it's simpler? And I think at the end of the day, there's not really a straightforward, simple reason to care more about why it's simpler. And I think there's always that question. It's just part of the reason is we like simpler explanations, and very often they seem to be more useful. But at the end of the day, sometimes the more complex explanation might end up being right.
Okay, thank you. That was very helpful.
Okay, yeah, but that's an amazing question, like truly an excellent question. All right, so I've now said everything I want to say about Fodor for today. So the main takeaways from this, just to paint it, is this first class was just, here's Fodor asking questions about blah, blah, blah. He's basically trying to say, folk psychology is good. Let me give you some explanations. The next class, let me give you 3 reasons why it's good. 1, it's really powerful. 2, it's a really deep and actually quite scientific, complex theory with many moving parts. And 3, if we actually want to even say what we're trying to explain, we need it in the picture. Now, next week, we're going to take him, and he is very quick to realize, all right, but just like anything else, folk psychology is probably not going to be perfect. So once we start doing science and cognitive science, we're going to want to bring in things that our folk psychology doesn't really allow for. So for instance, most of human history, there was no thought that we might have unconscious thoughts or unconscious desires or things that processing going on that we're not thinking about. Then along came Freud, and people jumped on board and have taken it and run with it. And now people say a lot of what's happening in our mind isn't stuff that we think about consciously. It just happens. And so how can you incorporate that into a theory of psychology while still keeping around the basic idea of belief, desire, psychology? So that's what Fodor is going to talk about in the next couple classes. Is just, all right, let's accept that folk psychology is right. Now, we're also going to accept that broadly speaking, it's right, but it's going to need to be tweaked up or fixed in a few different areas. So how do we develop something which we can call science, but also begins with folk psychology? And then how would that be implemented? What would that even look like in a human mind? So those are what our next 2 classes are going to be looking at. But you're all good for now, and I will see you next Thursday. I will post another one of those little questions, but this is it for now. I'm just going to stop the recording. If you have any questions, feel free to stick around. Otherwise,